Number 1. Nakwakto Rapids. Somewhere on the central coast of British Columbia, there is an island that shakes, not in an earthquake, not in a storm. It trembles 4 times a day on a schedule because of moving water. The island is a small rock called Turret Rock, and it sits in the throat of a narrow channel known as Nakwakto Rapids. When the tide turns, the sea comes for it. And the rock, by every account from the people who have stood on it, shudders under the force. Nakwakto guards the entrance to Seymour Inlet and Belisa Inlet. Behind that gateway sits an enormous inland system of fjords, a basin that fills and empties with each tide. All of that water has to pass through one narrow, shallow gap. Picture squeezing a river through a doorway. The water has nowhere to spread, so it accelerates. This is the same principle an engineer would call the Venturi effect. And here it produces one of the fastest tidal currents on the entire planet. The numbers are hard to believe. At peak flow, the current is commonly cited at around 16 knots. That is roughly 30 kilometers per hour, fast enough that a small boat with a modest engine simply cannot make headway against it. Some sources have called Nakwakto the fastest navigable tidal current ever recorded. We should be honest here, because that crown is disputed. A strait in Norway, which you will meet later, is usually credited with the strongest tidal current in the world. So the fair description is this: Nakwakto is among the very fastest, and almost no one has heard of it. Why does the rock tremble? The water does not strike Turret Rock like a hammer. Instead, the immense volume rushing past transmits pressure pulses through the stone, a low and constant vibration you can feel in your feet. Sailors who have tied up to the rock at slack water describe a faint living hum that builds as the current returns. The window for safe passage is brutally short. Nakwakto runs on the semi-diurnal cycle, which means roughly 4 exchanges of water every day. Between each flood and ebb, there is a moment called slack water, when the current pauses before reversing. At Nakwakto, that pause can last only a few minutes. Miss it, and the channel fills with standing waves, overfalls, and boils. On the downstream side, the jet of water peels away from the rock walls and curls into whirlpools. There is a tradition here. Boaters who manage to transit at full flood sometimes paint the name of their vessel onto the barnacle-crusted face of Turret Rock, a small dare written in marine paint. The local Kwakwaka'wakw people knew the danger of these inlets long before any of those names appeared. Today, the channel draws extreme kayakers who surf the standing waves, while commercial traffic mostly stays away. The numbers around slack water are unforgiving. The pause between flood and ebb can be so brief that captains plan their entire day around a single window, sometimes only a handful of minutes wide. Arrive early, and the current still runs hard against you. Arrive late, and it has already turned. The shape of the channel floor does the rest. The bathymetry funnels and squeezes the flow, accelerating it the way a thumb pressed over the end of a hose speeds up the water. Documented video descents show kayakers surfing waves that rise and vanish within seconds, a towering standing wave one moment and flat water the next. Notice what makes this place lethal. It is not depth. It is speed, turbulence, and the absence of any safe window to cross. Remember that idea because it defines every location in this video. A hazard on a chart is rarely about how deep the water goes. It is about how violently the water moves and whether a captain can ever find a safe moment to pass. So if a remote rock in Canada can shiver under the weight of the tide, imagine what older sailors believed was happening beneath the surface. On the far side of the Atlantic, the Vikings looked at a spinning sea and decided something down there was grinding the ocean into salt. Number 2. The Swelkie. Between the north coast of mainland Scotland and the Orkney Islands lies a strait called the Pentland Firth. It connects the Atlantic Ocean to the North Sea, and it is widely regarded as one of the most dangerous stretches of tidal water anywhere on Earth. During spring tides, currents here can run somewhere between 10 and 16 knots. Into that chaos, the Old Norse sailors placed a monster they could name. They called the whirlpool the Swelkie. The name comes from the Old Norse word svelgur, which means the swallower, and the Norse did not stop at a name. They built a story. In the legend of the Great Mill Grotti, a magical millstone could grind out anything its turners wished for. A sea king named Mysing stole the mill and ordered his giantess slaves to grind salt endlessly aboard his ship. They ground so much that the ship sank. And the mill, the story says, still turns on the seabed today, grinding salt, which is why the sea is salty and why the water above it spins. The Swelkie sits off the northern tip of the island of Stroma, and for 1,000 years it carried that explanation. The Pentland Firth has a second named horror. It is called the Merry Men of May. This is not a whirlpool, but a line of enormous standing waves that builds off St. John's Point on the ebb tide. These waves can rise several meters high and form a wall of breaking water across the strait, capable of swamping a vessel that wanders into them. The name is grim sailor's humor. There is nothing merry about it. The science behind the fear is simple to state and terrifying in practice. A vast volume of water moves between the Atlantic and the North Sea on every tide. It is forced through a narrow channel studded with islands and floored by an uneven seabed. When wind blows against that current, a condition sailors call wind over tide, the seas become short, steep, and savage. The races and whirlpools shift position with the state of the tide, so the danger is never quite in the same place twice. The cold is its own weapon. The water of the Pentland Firth stays frigid all year, so even a sailor who survives the initial capsize faces the rapid onset of cold shock and hypothermia. Survival times in such water are measured in minutes, not hours. This is part of why the Firth has claimed so many vessels across the centuries. Victims not only of the current and the rocks, but of the fog that can hide the races until a ship is already trapped inside them. For all that, the Pentland Firth is a working shipping route. Vessels pass through it constantly, but they do so with respect, with pilots who know the water, and with tide tables open. Centuries of shipwrecks line the seabed here, victims of current, rock, and fog. There is a modern twist. The very ferocity that makes the Firth deadly also makes it valuable. In the inner sound of the Pentland Firth sits Maygen, one of the largest tidal stream energy projects in the world. Turbines anchored to the seabed harvest the same current that has drowned ships for 1,000 years. The danger has become a power plant. Consider what survived all that time. The Old Norse name Svelgur still appears in spirit on modern navigation. The warning the Vikings encoded in a myth is the same warning a captain reads today. Different language, same message, stay clear. The Norse blamed a sunken mill. But a whirlpool does not need an ancient legend to nearly destroy a ship. On the other side of the planet, in the South Pacific, a narrow channel almost ended one of the great voyages of European exploration. Number 3. French Pass. In the Marlborough Sounds of New Zealand, a slender channel separates D'Urville Island from the northern tip of the South Island. The Maori name for it is Te Aomiti, a word that speaks directly to the swirling, sucking current that defines the place. Long before any European saw it, that name carried the warning. Here, the water grabs. The pass channel's strong tidal flows between Tasman Bay and the outer sounds. The current can reach around 8 knots. That is slower than Nakwakto or the Pentland Firth. And yet French Pass has a fearsome reputation. The reason is geography. The channel is narrow, rock-bound, and shallow in places, so even a moderate current is twisted into a powerful whirlpool with violent overfalls and eddies along its rocky edges. Speed is not the only thing that kills. Confinement does too. The English name comes from a near disaster. In 1827, the French explorer Jules Dumont d'Urville attempted to take his corvette, the Astrolabe, through the passage. The ship struck rock and was very nearly lost in the turbulent water. It was a celebrated brush with catastrophe, and the channel has carried its nationality in its name ever since. Then comes one of the strangest and most charming stories in all of maritime history. Beginning around 1888, a single dolphin started meeting ships near the entrance to French Pass. He was a Risso's dolphin, pale and scarred, and sailors named him Pelorus Jack. For roughly 24 years, until about 1912, he rode the bow waves of passing vessels and appeared to escort them through the dangerous water. He became so famous and so valued that in 1904, the government of New Zealand protected him by an order in council. He may have been the first individual sea creature ever protected by law. The story of Pelorus Jack captured the world precisely because it inverted the usual relationship between sailors and dangerous water. For once, the sea seemed to send a guide instead of a monster. Passengers crowded the rails to watch for him, and his absence on any given crossing was noted with worry. When he finally stopped appearing around 1912, rumors spread that he had been harmed, and the loss was mourned far beyond New Zealand. French Pass remains a demanding route for recreational boaters. The tidal streams reverse with the tide, the slack windows are short, and the whirlpool forms reliably on the current. The Marlborough. Sounds themselves are a drowned river valley, a landscape of flooded ridges, and French Pass is one of the constrictions where all that tidal water concentrates. The strong flow feeds rich marine life, which is part of why a clever dolphin found it worth his while to linger. Early European charts flagged the pass as a serious hazard for sailing ships that had no engine to fight the current. Today, engines have reduced the danger, though they have not erased it. And just as you will see at other sites, the hazard has become a spectacle. Tour operators now run trips specifically to show visitors the whirlpool spinning on the tide. French Pass merely spins boats and tests captains. So now raise the stakes. Where on earth does the single largest whirlpool in an entire hemisphere appear, and what does it sound like? Number 4. The Old Sow Whirlpool. In the cold water between Deer Island in New Brunswick, Canada, and the town of Eastport, Maine, in the United States, the sea makes a sound like a pig. That sound gave the largest whirlpool in the Western Hemisphere its unusual name. They call it the Old Sow. The smaller vortices that spin around it are called, with affection, the piglets. The Old Sow lives in a place built for extremes. It sits at the mouth of Passamaquoddy Bay, fed by the tides of the Bay of Fundy, and the Bay of Fundy has the highest tidal range on Earth. In some places, the water rises and falls more than 15 meters between low and high tide. That is a staggering volume of water, surging in and out twice a day, and it has to go somewhere. There are two ideas about the name. The popular one says the Old Sow comes from the pig-like sucking and gurgling the water makes as it churns. A quieter explanation traces the word to sow, an old term for a draining, sucking sound. Either way, the name captures something true. This whirlpool announces itself by voice. It is strongest about 3 hours before high tide on the flood, and most violent around the new moon and the full moon when tides reach their peak. The mechanism here is special. It is not simply one fast channel. A huge volume of water flows over an irregular seabed that includes a deep underwater trench, and currents arriving from different directions around Deer Island collide with one another. That collision is what spins the surface into a giant rotating funnel. When it is fully active, the Old Sow is not a single neat hole in the sea. It is a shifting field of funnel-shaped vortices, upwelling boils where water erupts from below, and standing waves. At its peak, the disturbed area has been reported on the order of 75 meters across or more. It moves, it builds, it fades. Authorities on both sides of the border warn small craft to keep clear near peak tide, and there are documented cases of boats being spun, swamped, or simply unable to hold a course in the turbulence. The colliding current mechanism sets the Old Sow apart from a simple tidal race. Here, water funneling around Deer Island meets water surging up from the deeper basin, and where the two streams cross, the surface is wrenched into rotation. It is less like a drain emptying, and more like two rivers fighting over the same patch of sea. That is why the whirlpool wanders, why it boils and erupts in unexpected places, and why no two tides ever produce quite the same spectacle. The town of Eastport has made peace with its neighbor. It promotes Old Sow viewing, and there is even a tongue-in-cheek Old Sow Whirlpool Survivors Association for those who have crossed it. Local ferries time their runs around the tide and the current. The cold North Atlantic water, though, keeps the danger real. A capsize here is not a joke. The strength rises and falls with the moon. At spring tides it is dramatic, at neap tides it is mild. That rhythm tied to the heavens is the same clockwork that drives every whirlpool you have met so far, a whole hemisphere's largest whirlpool, and still most people have never heard of it. But there is one spinning sea that almost everyone recognizes, a place so photogenic it became a national icon. For that, travel to Japan. Number 5. The Naruto Whirlpools. Between the island of Shikoku and Awaji Island, in the Naruto Strait, the sea spins in great blue spirals that have been famous for centuries. These are the Naruto Whirlpools, and they are perhaps the most painted, photographed, and visited whirlpools on Earth. The strait connects the calm Seto Inland Sea to the open waters of the Pacific, and at its narrowest, it is only about 1.3 kilometers wide. The cause is beautifully simple, and it is the clearest example of one of the key mechanisms behind all of these places. The Seto Inland Sea and the Pacific side do not always sit at the same height. During the tidal cycle, the water level on one side can be as much as 1.5 meters higher than on the other. Water always seeks its own level, so it rushes through the narrow strait to balance the difference. That rush reaches speeds of around 13 to 15 kilometers per hour, among the fastest currents in Japan, and where the fast water shears against slower water, it curls into whirlpools. At spring tides, around the new moon, in the full moon, the largest of these whirlpools can reach about 20 meters across. The timing is so predictable that it is published for tourists. The Great Naruto Bridge spans the strait, and beneath it runs a glass-floored walkway called the Uzunomichi, where visitors can stand directly above the spinning water. Tour boats carry sightseers to the very edge of the vortices. The whirlpools are woven into Japanese culture. The celebrated artist Utagawa Hiroshige depicted the Naruto Rapids in his prints, fixing the image in the national imagination generations ago. Yet behind the beauty lies the old danger. For traditional vessels without engines, the strait demanded local knowledge and respect. The whirlpools form and dissolve within minutes as eddies shed from the main current and spin themselves out. The economic weight of the whirlpools is hard to overstate. They anchor the identity of the entire region, lending their name to local products, museums, and festivals. What was once a deadly obstacle for fishermen and traders is now the reason hundreds of thousands of visitors make the journey each year. The strait itself did not change. Our relationship to it did, the moment engines and bridges removed the threat and left only the wonder. Naruto shows the same lesson as French Pass and Saltstraumen. A whirlpool's danger comes from speed and turbulence, not from great depth. And it shows another pattern that runs through this whole story. A place that once meant death for sailors can become, with bridges and tour boats and timetables, a wonder that people pay to see. Japan's whirlpools are large and famous. But which strait actually holds the world record, the single strongest tidal current measured anywhere on the planet? For that answer, go north to the Arctic edge of Norway. Number 6. Saltstraumen. Near the city of Bodo, in the far north of Norway, there is a strait that holds a world record. It is called Saltstraumen, and it has the strongest tidal current ever measured. If you want to understand the raw power of the tide, this is the place to look, because here the numbers are not estimates wrapped in legend. They are clean, measured, and almost absurd. The strait connects two large bodies of water, the Skirstad Fjord and the Salt Fjord. It is about 3 kilometers long, and at its narrowest point, it is only around 150 meters wide. Through that slender gap, roughly 400 million cubic meters of seawater are forced every 6 hours. Try to hold that figure in your mind. 400 million cubic meters surging back and forth 4 times a day. The result is a current that reaches up to about 22 knots. That is something like 37 to 40 kilometers per hour, the speed of a car on a city street made of solid, moving sea. The flow tears itself into whirlpools up to 10 meters across and several meters deep. You can hear them. The roar of Saltstraumen carries across the water during peak flow, and the surface visibly mounds upward, swollen and chaotic. The mechanism is the same constriction effect you saw at Nakwakto, taken to an extreme. A large tidal range drives a huge volume of water through a narrow, shallow link between two basins. The water has no choice but to accelerate. As the high-speed jet enters the wider fjord beyond, it separates and rolls into rotating vortices. People have lived beside this place for thousands of years. Ancient rock carvings near the strait record human presence in deep antiquity. The reason is food. The churning water is rich in oxygen and nutrients, and it draws enormous fish. Saltstraumen is a world-renowned sport fishery, famous for huge coalfish, cod, halibut, and wolffish. Since 1978, the Saltstraumen Bridge has carried a road over the strait, giving visitors a place to stand and watch the Maelstrom churn below. The fishery is a direct consequence of the violence. As the current scours the strait, it lifts nutrients from the seabed and saturates the water with oxygen, turning the churn into a feeding ground. Predatory fish gather to hunt in the turbulence, and anglers gather to hunt the fish. The same force that would drown a careless boater builds one of the richest concentrations of marine life on the Norwegian coast. Destruction and abundance, driven by the identical mechanism. Boaters here live and die by the clock. You transit at slack water in the brief calm between flood and ebb, or you do not transit at all. At peak flow, the strait is no place for any small vessel. Divers and kayakers come, but only with the timing worked out to the minute. So the strongest current on the planet has a name and an address. But raw speed is not the only thing that earns a place on a chart as forbidden. The third largest whirlpool in the world is the one a navy formally declared unnavigable, and it nearly drowned one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. Number 7. Corryvreckan. Off the west coast of Scotland, in the Inner Hebrides, a strait runs between the islands of Jura and Scarba. It is called the Gulf of Corryvreckan, and it holds the third largest whirlpool in the world, ranked behind Saltstraumen and the Maelstrom you will meet last. Of every place in this video, Corryvreckan fits the title most precisely, because the Royal Navy has, in plain language, charted it as water you should not enter. The name comes from Gaelic, often translated as the Cauldron of the Speckled Seas, from Corryvreckan. And a cauldron is exactly what it resembles. The mechanism here is different from a simple narrow channel. Beneath the gulf rises a tall underwater pinnacle, a pillar of basalt that stands up from the seabed, and beside it lies a deep hole. When the powerful Atlantic flood tide pours through the gulf, it slams into that pinnacle and is forced upward. The result is violent upwelling, standing waves, and the great whirlpool itself. The water can run at around 8.5 knots or more. The standing waves can rise to about 4.5 meters, roughly 15 feet, walls of water in a narrow strait, and the sound carries. Under the right conditions, the roar of Corryvreckan can reportedly be heard from as far as 16 kilometers away, which is about 10 miles. The whirlpool is at its worst on the flood tide, especially when a westerly wind blows against the current. This is why the Royal Navy historically classed the Gulf as unnavigable. It is one of the very few whirlpools recognized by name as a serious hazard in official British navigational documents. A government wrote it down. Stay out. Then there is the writer. In 1947, George Orwell was living on the island of Jura, working on the novel that would become 1984. He took a small boat out near the Gulf, misjudged the tide, and was caught. The boat capsized. Orwell and his companions, including young children, were thrown into the water and managed to scramble onto a small rocky islet from which they were rescued. The author who imagined the future nearly died in a Scottish whirlpool. What nearly killed Orwell was the oldest mistake in these waters, a misjudged tide. The Gulf is calm enough to cross at slack and lethal an hour later. His outboard motor was torn from the boat by the turbulence, leaving the party to row for their lives toward a bare rock. They lost the boat but kept their lives, and the episode became one of the most famous near drownings in literary history. Scotland gave Corryvreckan its own legend, and it rhymes with the Norse one. Here, the spinning water belongs to the Cailleach, the hag goddess of winter. The story says she uses the Gulf as a great wash tub to clean her enormous plaid, and when she is done, the cloth is white. That whiteness is the foam. Notice the pattern. The Vikings imagined a mill grinding salt. The Scots imagined a goddess washing her cloak. Across cultures and centuries, people looked at the same violent water and reached for a story to explain it. Corryvreckan earned a Navy's official warning and nearly killed a great writer. But there is one whirlpool that did something even larger. It gave its name to the entire phenomenon, and in the pages of fiction, it swallowed ships whole. Number 8. The Maelstrom. In the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway, between the island of Moskenesoya and the smaller island of Mosken, lies the whirlpool system that named all the others. Its proper name is the Maelstrom, but the world knows it by the word it gave us, the Maelstrom. The word comes from the Old Dutch and Norwegian, meaning a grinding or churning current, and for centuries, it has stood for the ultimate vortex. The Maelstrom is different in kind from most of the places you have seen. It does not form in a tight little channel between two rocks. It forms in relatively open water, driven by strong tides shaped by the seabed and funneled by the islands and the great Vestfjorden behind them. Currents here are commonly sighted up to around 10 or 11 kilometers per hour, and the whirlpools spread across a broad area. When the tide meets the wind and the heavy Atlantic swell, the seas turn chaotic and break in every direction. What makes the Maelstrom extraordinary is not only the water. It is the legend the water inspired. As early as 1539, the scholar Olaus Magnus drew it on his famous map, the Carta Marina, as a monstrous vortex devouring ships, and that image spread across Europe. Later thinkers tried to explain it with bold and wrong ideas. The scholar Athanasius Kircher proposed that the whirlpool was a drain, sucking seawater into a vast subterranean abyss inside the earth and spitting it out elsewhere. It was wrong, but it was the kind of theory that the sheer drama of the place seemed to demand. Then, literature took over. In 1841, Edgar Allan Poe published the short story A Descent into the Maelstrom, in which a fisherman is dragged into a colossal funnel and survives to tell of it. In 1870, Jules Verne sent the submarine Nautilus to its apparent doom in the Lofoten Maelstrom at the very climax of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. By then, the Maelstrom was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of nature's power to swallow human ambition. Here is the honest reckoning. The real Maelstrom is dangerous, but it is far smaller than the literary funnels. It will threaten a small boat. It will not pull an ocean liner down a hole into the center of the earth. The turbulent, nutrient-rich water makes it a fine fishing ground, and the Kiaut fishermen of Lofoten have worked its edges for centuries, navigating by hard-won knowledge of the tide. Today it draws tourists and sea kayakers who come, like everywhere else in this story, at carefully chosen states of the tide. The gap between the legend and the measurement is the real lesson of the Maelstrom. Sailors exaggerated, mapmakers embellished, and novelists turned a strong tidal current into a bottomless throat in the sea. Yet the exaggeration grew from a genuine seed. The Saltstraumen truly can overwhelm a small open boat, and for the Lofoten fishermen who depended on these waters, that was danger enough to justify every story ever told about it. Old charts have marked the Saltstraumen as a hazard for centuries, which means the Maelstrom fulfills the promise of this video as completely as any place can. It was charted, it was feared, and it was forbidden. And the word it gave us is the word we use for every other whirlpool on Earth. 8 places, 8 violent spinning seas. Now that you have seen them, the deeper question rises to the surface. Why does water do this at all? Strip away the legends and the place names, and every whirlpool you have seen runs on the same physics. The gravitational pull of the moon and the sun raises the tide, and the tide is simply an enormous volume of water trying to move. A whirlpool is what happens when you make that water move through a place that cannot easily let it pass. There are only a handful of mechanisms at work. The first is the constriction, the Venturi effect, where a wide body of water is forced through a narrow gap and must accelerate. That is Nakwakto, that is Saltstraumen, that is the heart of the Pentland Firth. The second is a difference in water level between two connected seas where water rushes from the high side to the low side, as it does so clearly at Naruto. The third is underwater topography, a pinnacle or a ridge that forces the current upward, which is the secret of Corryvreckan. And the fourth is the collision of currents arriving from different directions, which is what spins the Old Sow. In every case, a vortex forms for the same reason. A fast-moving jet of water meets slower water or a solid boundary, and the difference in speed, what scientists call shear, makes the flow roll up into rotation. Where the fast water meets opposing flow or sudden shallows, it piles into standing waves and overfalls instead. This is why slack water exists and why it is so short. As the tide reverses, the flow must pass through zero on its way from flood to ebb. For a few minutes, the water is calm, then it builds again in the opposite direction. The strength of the whole system rises and falls with the moon. At spring tides, around the new and full moon, the range is greatest and the whirlpools are fiercest. At neap tides, they soften. There is also the matter of resonance. In a bay like the Bay of Fundy, the natural time it takes water to slosh from one end to the other nearly matches the rhythm of the tide. The two reinforce each other, and the tidal range swells to the largest on Earth. That amplified range is the hidden engine behind the Old Sow. The whirlpool you see at the surface is only the visible tip of a process that begins with the shape of the entire bay. The scale varies enormously. The whirlpools at Saltstraumen are about 10 meters across, while the Old Sow can sprawl across 75 meters or more. The speeds run from around 8 knots at French Pass in Corryvreckan up to about 22 knots at Saltstraumen. And notice the recurring lesson: depth barely matters. What matters is speed and turbulence. That same churning is why so many of these places, from Saltstraumen to the Maelstrom, are extraordinary fisheries, because the turbulence drags nutrients up from below and feeds the whole food chain. The physics, then, is understood. So why do navies still print these places on charts as zones to avoid? Long before satellites and sonar, the only chart that mattered was the one inside a local pilot's head. Sailors who survived a strait learned its moods, its timing, and its hidden races, and they passed that knowledge down by word of mouth. The names themselves were a kind of chart. The Swelkie, the Swallower, the Merry Men of May. Te Aumiti, the Sucking Current. Each name was a warning compressed into a word. As nations built navies and merchant fleets, that local knowledge was written down. The British Admiralty produced sailing directions that named hazards and told captains when and whether to attempt them. Corryvreckan is the clearest example. To label a stretch of water unnavigable in an official document is a serious act. It is a government telling its own sailors to keep away. On a modern nautical chart, these warnings survive as caution areas and notes about tidal races. The single most important tool for surviving these places is humble. It is the tide table. Knowing the exact minute of slack water is the difference between a safe crossing and a capsize. Around that knowledge grew lighthouses, beacons, and pillaged services, all designed to guide ships past water that could kill them. Indigenous and pre-modern knowledge often outran the official charts by centuries. The Maori named Te Aumiti and the Kwakwakawaku. Understanding of the British Columbia inlets encoded precise, practical warnings long before any hydrographer arrived with instruments. These were not vague superstitions, they were working models of dangerous water, refined by generations of people who could not afford to be wrong. Technology has changed the odds, but not the rules. The shift from sail to engine power was enormous because a sailing ship caught in a calm could be dragged helplessly into a whirlpool, while an engine gives a captain a fighting chance. Radar, satellite positioning, and current prediction have made transit safer still. Yet none of it has erased the danger. The water moves the same way it always has. And then comes the final turn, the one that defines our own era. The same currents that drowned ships are now seen as a resource. In the Pentland Firth, the Maygen project anchors turbines to the seabed to harvest the tide as renewable electricity. Engineers eye Corryvreckan and other races the same way. Meanwhile, the places too famous to ignore have become tourism economies. Naruto has its glass walkway, Saltstraumen its bridge, Lofoten its kayak tours. The fear has been mapped, then managed, and finally monetized. Charts can explain the danger. But charts do not explain the fear. For that, you have to go back to the stories people told. Across the world, in cultures that never met, people looked at spinning water and reached for the same kind of explanation. They made the whirlpool into a creature, a machine, or a god. This is not a coincidence. It is what the human mind does when it confronts a force it cannot control. The Norse gave the Pentland Firth the mill called groti, forever grinding salt on the seabed. The Scots gave Corryvreckan the Kylek, the winter goddess washing her plaid until the foam ran white. The Greeks, long before either, gave the world Charybdis, the monster in Homer's Odyssey that swallowed the sea 3 times a day and spat it back out. We deliberately left Charybdis off our list because the real whirlpools of the Strait of Messina are mild compared to the 8 you have seen. But the myth is the point. Charybdis is the original whirlpool monster, and every legend since is its descendant. Cartographers carried the fear into their craft. Olaus Magnus drew the Maelstrom as a ship-devouring vortex in 1539. Athanasius Kircher imagined it as a drain into the hollow earth. Then the writers took the legend to its peak. Poe sent a fisherman spiraling into the funnel. Verne sent a submarine. The Maelstrom became shorthand for any force large enough to swallow human ambition whole. These myths were not merely entertainment. For sailors who could not read, a vivid story about a swallowing monster was a navigational aid. It said, in the most memorable possible terms, do not go there. The recurring image of a swallower, captured in the very words Svelgur and Maelstrom, was a warning system encoded in language and passed across generations. There's a psychology to it as well. A spinning vortex draws the eye and unsettles the gut in a way that few natural sights can match. It suggests something hungry, something with intent, a hole in the world that wants to pull you in. That primal unease is why the whirlpool became a monster in so many traditions, and why, even armed with the physics, we still feel a flicker of dread standing over one. Not every whirlpool legend is dark. French past gave us Polaris Jack, the dolphin who guided ships through danger, a benevolent guardian for the modern age. And in our own time, tourism has begun to remythologize these places once more, turning monsters into marvels and warnings into wonders. We have accounted for the physics, and we have accounted for the fear. So what, in the end, is actually left to fear? It would be comforting to say that we have fully tamed these waters. We have not. The behavior of turbulent, swirling fluid remains one of the hardest problems in all of physics. We can predict the tide with great precision, down to the minute of slack water. But the exact shape and timing of an individual whirlpool, the moment a vortex forms, and where it wanders, still resists perfect prediction. The sea keeps a margin of surprise. The future may make these places more dangerous, not less. As sea levels rise and the climate shifts, the tidal regimes that drive these currents could change in ways that are difficult to forecast. More frequent and more violent storms mean more of the wind over tide conditions that turn a hazard into a killer. The no-go zones on the chart may not stay exactly where they are. At the same time, we keep pushing further into these violent waters, not away from them. Tidal energy projects are expanding into the very straits sailors once avoided. New survey tools, multi-beam sonar, drifting sensors, and detailed computer models are refining our charts and our understanding. And ordinary people, armed with cameras and tour boat tickets, are documenting peak events that scientists once struggled to witness. Look at where these 8 places sit on the map, and a pattern emerges. They cluster in high tidal range coastlines and narrow channels, the specific geographies where the tide is concentrated and forced to accelerate. They are not scattered at random. They are the predictable products of a planet whose seas are pulled twice a day by the moon. There is something in us that is drawn to dangerous water, that wants to stand on a bridge above Saltstraumen or a glass floor above Naruto and watch the sea spin. Perhaps it is the same instinct that made our ancestors invent the monster and the mill. We want to look at the thing that could destroy us from a place just safe enough. Each of these 8 places is, in a sense, a clock. They keep time with the moon, marking the same intervals that have governed the sea since long before the first sailor pushed off from shore. We have learned to read that clock well enough to slip across at the safe minute. We have not learned to stop it, and we never will. Return, for a moment, to where this began. To a small rock on the coast of British Columbia that trembles 4 times a day. Even solid stone yields to moving water, given enough of it in a narrow enough gap. That is the quiet truth beneath every legend and every chart. The tide that drowned the ships is still running. It is turning the Old Sow and the Swelkie and the Maelstrom right now, on schedule, indifferent to us, exactly as it has for longer than there have been names to give it. The ocean was spinning these whirlpools long before we arrived to fear them, and it will go on spinning them long after our charts have faded.